I'm going to welcome everyone to this meeting. This meeting is about defiance in Greece, resistance to Europe, the world economy, and fascism. Greece, of all European countries, has had a very long and proud tradition of resistance to reaction in all its forms, whether it was the Nazis in the Second World War, its own reactionary kernels in the 1970s, or the world and Europe's bank. Generation after generation of Greek workers and youth have risen up against oppression on behalf of themselves, the Greek workers, but also representing a great part of the movement in Europe against reaction. And that's why the discussion we're having today is so important, because with new moves by Greece's right-wing government to bring police back onto the campuses in Greece, which evokes memories of the worst repression of students and university freedoms during the 1970s, there's a new wave of resistance opening up in Greece. And we are privileged to have three really good speakers, well placed to give a report on these developments this afternoon. We have Roger Silverman, who, as comrades, he needs no introduction, as comrades know, has written a book recently about resistance in Greece. And after Roger will speak Soteris Valchos, an activist based in Greece, and Themos Demetriou, who we know well from our meetings, who is also very, very clued up on the struggle of the Greek workers. So I'm going to hand over directly to Roger, who's going to speak for about 20 minutes first.
When studying the history of every country that I'm ever writing about or visiting, I'm always struck by the massive, buried, hidden history of the role of the working class in struggle, whether we're talking about Britain or America, or whether it's countries in Asia, in India. But I must say, above all, in Greece, it's an absolutely breathtaking story from the very beginning. Creating their state in a prolonged guerrilla war against the great powers, and initially, after that, a pawn of the British. Just in passing, we're told recently that the late Prince Philip was the son of the King of Greece. But what we're not told is that that royal family were actually Danish, so had no connection whatsoever with Greece, and they were arbitrarily planted as the rulers of Greece by the British on behalf of the British in Victorian times. The Greeks fought wars. They were routed by the Turks in Asia Minor at around 100 years ago, but particularly in the Second World War. It was the Greeks who won the first popular uprising against occupation by the Axis powers as early as 1940, when they victoriously drove out the armies of Italian fascism. And the fact actually that the Germans had to take over the occupation of Greece, put back the huge resistance put up against their rule, actually put back their invasion of Russia quite fatefully, which meant that they went in winter and actually altered the whole course of the war. Under the Nazi occupation, the Greeks they waged an absolutely heroic guerrilla struggle of popular resistance, and they actually single-handedly overthrew the occupation. And in mass urban uprisings against the Nazis too, it was the only country, with the possible exception of Yugoslavia, which single-handedly overthrew Nazi rule by a popular insurrection. In fact, even Churchill had to say, from now on, we'll have to say not that the Greeks fought like heroes, we'll have to say that heroes fought like Greeks. That did not, however, stop him from mowing down the jubilant Athens crowds that celebrated liberation and launching the most brutal and bloodthirsty civil war against the Greek partisans. Once they'd driven out the Nazis, the British arrived, they turned their guns on the resistance, and the Greek population then suffered years of civil war against the quisling elite, propped up first by the British and then the US Army. It was a kind of prototype for what happened in Indochina when the French imperialism was too exhausted to be able to maintain its rule, and the Americans took over the war against them too. It was followed by years of repressive rule under a pro-American quisling regime. The whole history of Greece is really belongs more in the history of Asia than of Europe, with big parallels, particularly with events in the Philippines. But then, just as a renewed revolutionary upsurge was once again gathering pace, came the brutal military dictatorship of the colonels, which was itself eventually overthrown following the heroic youth uprising at the Polytechnic in 1973, which Ed has already referred to. The whole story of the Greek working class of the Greek Revolution is an incredibly gripping story. I'm not going to resist the temptation to promote my book there, which I hope comrades will have a look at that. But once again, it was the Greek working class between 2010 and 2015 which lit a torch for the European and the world working class. There has been, of course, an insidious propaganda campaign branding the Greeks as spongers and parasites running up debts at the expense of their fellow Europeans. It was not just the personal debts of the squeezed and starved Greek people, but the ledger balances of European bankers and corporate international creditors that were bailed out. It's an outright lie that the Greek debt crisis is the result of successive governments' irresponsible profligacy in spending. Actually, nowhere in the world have the poor got poorer so catastrophically fast as in Greece, and nowhere have they stood up so boldly for their rights. The average Greek worker works longer hours than any other country in Europe or any country in the world, actually, apart from South Korea. Now, under the heel of the troika, that's the IMF, the European Commission, and the European Central Bank, the lifeblood of the Greek population was squeezed out of them. Between 2009 and 2016, the poorest 20% of Greece's 11 million people suffered a 42% drop in their disposable income, driving them into utter, almost starvation conditions. The true nature of Greece's catastrophe is a direct consequence of the 2008 world financial crisis. The primary explanation was to be found not in any homegrown Greek malpractices, but in the colossal exposure of French and German banks to trades in US toxic derivatives. When the crisis hit, the banks of France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Britain had exposure in excess of $30 trillion, almost 3 times the national incomes of all 4 countries put together. And it was not the personal debts of the squeezed and starved Greek people, but the ledger balances of European bankers and corporate international creditors that were bailed out. The loans to Greece were actually for military armaments at colossally inflated prices. Of course, bank loans are not like personal loans between friends. The very last thing creditors want is their money back. Debts are logged on the credit, not the debit side of the ledger. They're considered to be lucrative assets. And the Greek debt stood at around 315 billion euros. Every man, woman, and child, every baby born today starts with a debt burden around their neck of almost 30,000 euros. So fraudulently misrepresenting what was actually a massive bailout of these banks as an act of solidarity with the profligate and lazy Greeks, the European governments and the ECB wriggled their way around the Eurozone's ban on EU financing of government debt by dishonestly in the deal as of bilateral loans, as well as by luring into their conspiracy the IMF, And by the way, that all too was in flagrant contravention of its own rules. And what was achieved was actually a cynical transfer of losses from the books of the Franco-German banks to the shoulders of Europe's weakest taxpayers. Greece underwent an experience that can best be described as the vivisection of an entire population, a laboratory experiment conducted on the living body of the Greek nation to test out how far it could withstand the trauma of ever more drastic surgical amputation. So, over 5 years, the Greek people staged a spontaneous mobilization from riots to strikes to demonstrations to occupations to general strikes, and eventually converging into a political front, a broad spectrum of protest. It was the streets, the squares, the public spaces that became the battlegrounds. The mass occupation of the city squares was the most eloquent, striking public manifestation conceivable of popular outrage, an assertion in the flesh of the common popular solidarity of the 99% stretching across the entire mass of the oppressed and divided population. Greece witnessed the most dramatic conceivable eruptions of popular outrage, an assertion of human solidarity stretching across the entire mass of the oppressed and deprived. There were, at least in that period, at least 42 general strikes. For months on end, tens of thousands of people occupied Athens Syntagma Square and city squares throughout Greece. 35% of the total population physically participated in street demonstrations. 35% of the total population of men, women, and children physically participated. And in opinion polls, 33% of the population actually called in so many words for revolution. When the SYRIZA government was elected in January 2015, its support having swelled over the previous 6 years from 4.6% to 36.3% of the vote. It was that same spirit that had propelled it to power. Its election was the culmination of years of mass struggle not seen in Europe for decades. It could not have asked for a clearer mandate. The election of SYRIZA was a product of the spontaneous mobilization of the Greek people over the previous 5 years, as I say, from riots to general strikes, eventually converging into this political manifestation. Throughout its history of wars, occupations, coups, and revolutions, Greece had never nurtured a stable social democratic tradition. PASOK had flared into existence from nowhere in 1974 in a blaze of radical promises in the aftermath of the overthrow, or the collapse rather, of the colonel's dictatorship. And then just as suddenly it burst like a balloon in the wake of the economic crisis. SYRIZA was a strange party, one that resembled more closely the ephemeral left radical parties that sprang up in Europe in the 1930s, parties like the ILP, the POUM, and the SAP. Dynamic, fluid, volatile formations, intrinsically unstable, behaving almost like radioactive elements with a limited half-life, fleetingly seeking out a secure foundation and soon either subsiding into reformism, achieving a revolutionary mission, or just fizzling out. Now, when SYRIZA was elected, the finance minister in the crucial position, of course, was the famous Varoufakis. Varoufakis describes his arrival as an empty finance ministry without even the password to its computer system. It's, by the way, the whole story reminds me of an episode of the British sitcom Yes Minister, because at his first meeting with Treasury officials, he confronted them with the one and only question that mattered. How long had they before the money ran out? The reply? Things are not too bad, Minister. Anything between 11 days and 5 weeks. Right, there followed months, 6 months of sterile negotiations, a kind of chess game in which the massed pieces of the bankers were ranged against the Greeks' handful of pawns. Towering over the table loomed the monstrous shadow of the real, tangible, incontrovertible power of the banks. Taking power on the first day of SYRIZA's election victory, Prime Minister Tsipras had admonished Varoufakis, and he said, if the bastards find a way to stop us from delivering what we promised, you and I must be ready to get out on the streets again to plan the next demonstration. What actually happened is that faced with increasingly brazen ultimata from the troika, Tsipras played his desperate referendum gambit, gambling on a defeat or an inconclusive result that might let him off the hook. And when the result came through, the people had spoken, and their voice was deafening. When it came to the famous referendum, which took place in July 2015, 61.3% of the population voted to defy the bankers come what may. By a margin of almost 2 to 1, the Greek people cried no. Now, Varoufakis described the scene in the conference room on referendum night as he waited with other ministers for the result. And this is, I'm quoting from his memoirs. When the final number flashed up on the screen, 61.31% for no, in a turnout of 62.5%, I jumped up and punched the air, only to realize that I was the only one in the room celebrating. So the people had spoken, their voice was deafening. By a margin of almost 2 to 1, the Greek people had cried no. And the crucial climax of the book comes with Varoufakis' revealing account of the extraordinary exchange that followed immediately afterwards between himself and Tsipras. And again, quoting from his memoirs. When I entered his office, Alexis stared at me and said we had messed up badly. I decided to put it to him straight. Would he honour the no vote, or was he about to throw in the towel? At that point, Alexis confessed to something I had not anticipated. He told me that he feared a goody fate awaited us if we persevered. Now, the goody fate is a reference to the execution of 6 politicians and military leaders in 1922. So Alexis Tsipras was saying, we can't do anything because we might be shot. Alexis then began to insinuate that something like a coup might take place. Again, Varoufakis says, I've fended him off. Let them do their worst. Do you realize what 61.3% means? They didn't vote no for you to turn it into a yes. But actually, that's precisely what Tsipras did. The very next day, he turned it into a yes. Varoufakis resigned. And in other words, beset by traps and manipulated into fatal concessions, which brought it to a straight choice between martyrdom on one side and capitulation on the other, SYRIZA had flirted with the first option only to scuttle into the second. Tsipras was confessing to a wretched degree of cowardice, which could only have aroused contempt from the descendants of those literally hundreds of thousands of Greeks who had given their lives in the resistance to Nazi occupation and in the civil war which followed. In 1944, at colossal human cost, the Greek resistance had overthrown the Nazi occupation forces single-handed. And then again in 1974, the colonel's junta collapsed following a heroic youth uprising. So Tsipras's capitulation was, apart from anything else, a disgusting desecration of their memories. The SYRIZA government had found itself beset by traps, manipulated into fatal concessions, which brought it to a choice between defiance and martyrdom on the one hand, or humiliation and capitulation and betrayal on the other. It had flirted with the first option and then, as I say, scuttled into the second. It reminds you a little of the story about the Duke of Wellington, who was reviewing his troops on parade and concluded, I don't know what effect these men will have upon the enemy, but by God, they frighten me. Well, the massed ranks of the Greek revolutionary people certainly frightened Tsipras and Tsakalotis. That was the replacement for Varoufakis as Minister of Finance, into a shameful betrayal. So the lesson of these events is that once it comes to a direct confrontation between the capitalists and the bankers and the mass of the working people, then no amount of reason, guile, or cajolery can prevail. I'd like you to imagine, let's take this scenario. You're walking through a jungle and you come face to face with a hungry tiger. You've got a range of practical choices. You could throw it some scraps of meat and hope to divert it in that way. You can get out a gun and you can shoot it between the eyes. You can run for your life. Those are all reasonable options in the situation. One thing which is definitely not a good idea and never to be recommended is standing there, thumbing your nose and sticking your tongue out at it. That's never a good idea. And that's precisely, if you like, what Tsipras did for 6 months before capitulating to the hungry tiger of the banks. What about the alternative posed by Varoufakis? Maybe more honorable, but equally, I'm afraid, futile. Because sometimes, you know, the more daringly unconventional politician's style and persona, actually the more prudent and circumspect his policies. So Varoufakis had this image, the leather-jacketed motorcyclist. He struck an appealingly non-conformist public posture. But soon Europe's financial establishment was relieved to find itself facing actually a reassuringly pragmatic negotiator across the table, because Varoufakis started out from the stale and threadbare premise that the time is not ripe for socialist demands, and that in an age of neoliberalism, Keynesian reforms constituted the most radical alternative to hand. It was necessary to rescue European capitalism, as he put it, from itself. So in pursuit of his ever elusive goal of a rational, moderate Keynesian way out of the crisis, Varoufakis pressed for a debt restructuring package. Now, he's the first to admit, in his words, that there was, quote, nothing radical or particularly left-wing in this call. In fact, he admits to being, as again in his words, continually stunned by the support that I, a proud lefty, have received from a variety of right-wingers, Wall Street and City of London bankers, right-wing German economists, even US libertarians. Among his closest consorts throughout his standoff with the troika were former US Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, UN economist Jeff Sachs, the current French President Emmanuel Macron, and perhaps most startling of all, the former British Chancellor Lord Norman Lamont, a right-wing Tory, whom Varoufakis describes as, quote, a pillar of strength, a safe friend, and a constant supporter. Of course, Lamont was pursuing an anti-EU pre-Brexit agenda. Now, Varoufakis gives a gripping day-by-day account of his ingenious but futile efforts against a murky background of intrigue, backstabbing, and sabotage by some of his own cabinet colleagues to negotiate a deal, but apparently completely oblivious to his enemy's paramount need to inflict exemplary punishment on a people who had dared to challenge them. This was the first skirmish in a worldwide confrontation. After all, we face a common enemy. The Greek people's misfortune is that they launched their struggle a little ahead of the rest of us, and they found themselves facing the enemy alone. If proof is needed of their awareness of the power of international solidarity, it's necessary to look no further than the banners the demonstrators have been flying in Syntagma Square. Their defiant anti-capitalist slogans were written not just in Greek, but in English, Spanish, French, Italian, and German. They were consciously and explicitly rallying the working people of Europe to join together with them in a continental-wide uprising. Just over 5 years later, it's already a very different world today. From the Americas to Europe, to Africa, to Asia, and the Far East, as we keep repeating probably every week in our WIN meetings, the world is in turmoil and the people are on the move. The first skirmish has been lost, and the last word is yet to be spoken by all of us. And I think that's the lesson of the Greek experience. Thank you, comrades. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Roger, for a very concise and rousing introduction and a very sharp analysis of the background to the situation in Greece. We're now going over to Soteris Valchos. As I said earlier, Soteris is an activist based in Greece, over to you, Sotiris, for about 10 minutes, if you can manage that.
As Silverman said, the story of the Greek movement is a breathtaking story. The rise and struggle of SYRIZA before the capitulation also of its leadership was a breathtaking story. SYRIZA was elected in 2015 on a radical program to end austerity. That was, according to them, an unbargainable target. A unique feature of its program was that its struggle to end austerity would take place within the European Union. Abandoning the European Union and the Euro was out of the question. Its struggle would be given in collaboration with the European movement. Before it was elected, SYRIZA, representatives of it, even its leader Tsipras, participated in conferences of left parties of Europe, like Podemos of Spain, Sinn Féin of Ireland, and declared that together they would change Europe. These policies, this understanding was without precedent, at least in the after World War II Europe. Individuals or small isolated Marxist groups may have been sharing similar ideas, but the case now that these ideas were declared by a mass workers' party ready to take government was something totally unique. From January 2015, when SYRIZA was elected, until July 2015, it seemed that harsh negotiations were taking place between SYRIZA and the European institutions. When in July of 2015, things came to a deadlock, SYRIZA answered by organizing a referendum in which the Greek people would decide whether they would accept the continuation of austerity or reject it. The declaration of this referendum was answered by the European institutions by shutting down the banking system of Greece. The answer to this of the Greek people was magnificent, despite the fact that the functioning of the economy came to a halt for 2 weeks, producing a real hardship to the people. Almost 62% of the people voted against austerity, against the will of the European institutions. Magnificent, we have to say also, were the mobilizations that took place in a number of European countries. In some cases, hundreds of thousands of people participated in demonstrations in support of SYRIZA government. In Germany alone, as a report we have says, 1,000 smaller or bigger demonstrations took place in support of SYRIZA government. The hopes were huge, and what was at stake was huge. That is why, comrades, when the leadership of SYRIZA capitulated, despite the huge support at home and abroad, the disappointment and disorientation was proportionally huge. The fact that SYRIZA, soon after the referendum and the capitulation, was elected in government once more must not lead to false conclusions. The people of Greece took a severe blow. The movement of Greece was heavily defeated, something which was not immediately apparent, but was revealed in the years that followed. SYRIZA government became a government that took the responsibility of managing the affairs of capitalists, leading to the return of a harsh right-wing government today, with all the characteristics that Silverman has already referred to. The leaders of the government, the leaders of SYRIZA, and all the SYRIZA apparatus were degenerated, comrades, and there is no return from that. Still though, SYRIZA today remains the basic opposition party. And I consider that the basic perspective concerning SYRIZA is that it is the party in which the working class of Greece will give battles to change its policies, to transform it again to a tool for a real change. This, together with the fact that it still maintains the right for organized opposition within it, makes it the basic area in which Marxists should orient their work. The Communist Party of Greece did not manage to gain any of SYRIZA losses. What remains of the old Socialist Party of Papandreou of PASOK does not seem to be able to exceed a vote of more than 6 to 7%. And its program, far from being promising, it's a right-wing social democratic program. The only party of the left that now maintains a quite radical program is MERA25, a section of the pan-European movement DM25. MERA25 and DM25 were created by the ex-finance minister of SYRIZA, Yannis Varoufakis, that had undertaken the negotiations with the European institutions. Yannis Varoufakis has exhibited extraordinary stamina during the negotiation and has provided very important work, at least on the level of economic analysis. I shared the ideas, the opinion of Silverman that there are contradictory features in his character and his policies, but these are the basic strength points of Varoufakis. MERA25, comrades, was able to be elected in parliament in the elections of summer of 1919. That was a big success. In a first glance, this party looks quite promising. Its program is a real, today at least, it's a real radical program that includes the nationalization of the banking system with democratic control, a slogan that could be easily shared by us. The fact also that it considers itself as part of a pan-European movement, pan-European party, is also something extraordinary, unique and unprecedented in European politics, at least over the last decade. The problem was, though, they have to stress that with this party, which I consider a very serious problem, is that it tends to be more anti-SYRIZA party than anti-right-wing party. Its policies towards SYRIZA are sectarian. They don't miss the chance to declare that there are no differences between SYRIZA and the harsh right-wing government of today. This fact, together with the fact that it has virtually no working class basis, no presence in the organized labor movement, make me believe that its future is quite uncertain. At the level now of the conditions of the working class, there has been a reduction of the average salary by 10% only from 2019 to 2020. The total reduction of salaries, at least of the average salary, at least in the private sector, amounts to more than 40% since the beginning of the crisis. The average salary now in Greece in 2020 was 800 euros. During the above period, 2019 to 2020, there was a dramatic increase of the number of people living with less than 200 euros. This number was increased by 12-fold, comrades. 70% of the people of Greece today get salaries of less than 1,000 euros. Unemployment at the peak of the crisis reached the level of around 27%, a figure that reminds of the pre-World II Germany and USA. At the beginning of the coronavirus crisis, unemployment stood a little below 20%, with the unemployment of those below 25 at almost 40%. Of course, even these figures are false, bogus, because they don't take into account hundreds of thousands of people that left Greece seeking employment elsewhere in Europe. What are the real figures now? It's something it's hard to perceive. from a record of strikes and national strikes, something at which, towards which, something that Silverman refers to in his book, 42 something general strikes. The period after 2017, strikes decreased dramatically. And in 2019, 2020, despite the harsh austerity policies of the right-wing government, they were virtually non-existent. The only union that seemed to be doing something was the union controlled by the Communist Party. But in all cases, demonstrations or strikes, it did everything possible to remain alone. It followed every possible sectarian policy that would let it alone, as if they were trying in advance to secure the failure of any action of theirs. Both the social and economic situation in Greece are dire, as it is the mood in the working class today. The working class of Greece is, as I have already said, heavily defeated, and the only chance of revival in the short and immediate term is big events in the European class struggle, something of course that must be totally expected. Thank you, comrade.
Thank you very much, Soteris. So we're moving on now to Themos Dimitriou, who has also written many articles on the question of Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus. So over to you, Themos.
Well, first of all, to understand the question of SYRIZA and the perspectives of that party and the perspective of Greece, I'm going to give another viewpoint. Another viewpoint in the sense that it is not SYRIZA that is the main issue in what happened in Greece, but the popular movement. The people of Greece that in 2004, tired of Andreas Papandreou's epicons in the government, they voted the right wing into power. 5 years of right-wing rule, they convinced them that the right wing could offer nothing for the Greek people, and they returned the son of Andreas Papandreou, George Papandreou, to office with a huge majority. Of course, Papandreou did not have the vision, did not have he did not have the program to deliver what people expected from him. So in 2011, he capitulated to the troika and he signed the memorandum. And this was followed by strikes, general strikes, demonstrations, the indignados of the Syntagma Square, there was street violence. And in all this time, the only party that stood at the side of the people was this small coalition of a lot of small left groups that was SYRIZA. And this was the main force that pushed them to power by 1915. 1915 was followed for 6 months in 1915. There were the negotiations between Varoufakis and the Troika, and this is what we should try to be our judgment should be a bit more nuanced. Yes, Varoufakis was making retreat after retreat in his negotiations, but this was not a bad thing. This was not a bad thing in the sense that what he was doing it in front of the people, both of Greece and of Europe. And he managed little by little to reverse this picture of the bad Greeks and the good European officials and show that it was the Europeans that were trying to crush Greeks for their own benefit. And we came to the referendum. A referendum whose results shows the success of this policy, the success of winning the people behind them in this fight. And it was not only Varoufakis, it was Tsipras as well. And we should not start with the idea that Tsipras was planning to betray the people from the beginning. They were going quite well and their policies were paying off. But what happened in the end, they won in Greece, they got everything with them, but they still didn't manage to defeat the Europeans. They couldn't. They couldn't unless another revolution, another anti-austerity party came to power in another country in Europe. And that's where Tsipras and Varoufakis diverged. I could say that it was a similar question that was put to them as it was put to the Bolsheviks in 1917. Take power or capitulate. And there you have Lenin with Kamenev and Zinoviev disagreeing on that. And here you had Varoufakis and Tsipras. Of course, SYRIZA was not the Bolshevik party, and Varoufakis was no Lenin. And that's how I think we should approach this thing. The main thing of the Tsipras and Varoufakis campaign in that time, it was the definite decision not to leave Europe. Not in the sense that they considered Europe something very nice and that could be reformed. Even Varoufakis, who was proposing the reform of Europe, I don't think he ever believed that they would back down. I think it was just an attempt to present a moderate stance so that he could win support. And they realized that it was only on a European basis that progress should be made. And this still is valid today. What we have there in Greece cannot be resolved in Greece alone, as it cannot be resolved in any single country alone. And we should understand that unless this struggle sees itself as a pan-European attempt to change society, take it further as a world attempt to take society, it cannot succeed. We are back on the basics of perpetual revolution. We're back to the basics of Trotsky's assessment. And this is becoming more and more real. We can see everywhere in the world revolutions not realizing themselves because of the inability of each country to do that. Of course, this doesn't mean that we have to organize all over the world together first and then we just make a revolution. These things don't work that way. Explosions will take place every time. People will rise up. Wins and defeats will take place. But this is the sort of work we have to do. We have to be able to realize what we can do at some stage and try to follow the revolution at such a tempo that it will give rise to revolutions elsewhere. And this is something that very correctly Roger said, the Greeks started far earlier than us, far earlier than anybody else. But also we should see that this is not happening only in Greece. I mean, we have seen it in Britain with Corbyn. That's an interesting thing. That is a parallel to what happened in Greece. We can see similar things happening in America with Bernie Sanders. All these defeated movements, they have something in common. First, that they show that the people are beginning to stir, are beginning to rise. And they are attempting first with physical movement to fight back. Then they move to the political sphere and they try to take power, to change things. So my assessment of all this is that these days it's not enough to have a revolutionary theory and a revolutionary program. We have to link this to the people, and we have to link it. We only need a minimal program of demands for reforms. And this is what happened in Greece. Very minimal program was put forward and it won the day. That's what happened in Britain. Very minimal program, and it almost won the day. So in Greece, I think we should see that things will play out in very unpredictable ways. Very unpredictable because, as Sotiris said, SYRIZA's structures are corrupt. It's not what it used to be. But there are people there who could make a difference at some stage. Not now. Varoufakis, he has by far the best analysis I've read anywhere for both the Greek economy and the world economy. What he proposes, I'm not so sure at all. It's something else. His organizational approach, it seems disastrous. So what is going to happen in Greece? All these discussions will bring again and again issues forward. It will bring again and again people discussing about what is to be done. But most importantly, we have to look out what will happen in the class, what will happen in the movement, how they are going to respond to all these problems that are rising every day. And of course, the main thing is that it's very easy to see a resurgence of revolutionary movement in Greece if something similar happens elsewhere in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Themos. And I'll say a special, thank you for all three speakers. Really, really very informative and inspiring introduction to this discussion. A special word of thank you to Sotiris and Themos for speaking in a language other than your own native language. I know how difficult it is to do that in a public meeting. So we now have plenty of time for discussion, and I've already seen in the chat some comrades are raising important and interesting questions. Yes, Matthew Jones, please come in.
Thanks, comrades. That was very interesting. I think, for me, the experience of the SYRIZA government and its failure is extremely important for everybody, particularly in Europe. And I think it shows exactly the political questions which stand before us, and would have stood before us in the unlikely event of say, Jeremy Corbyn being Prime Minister, which I don't think would ever happen, because obviously the right wing would never have allowed him to walk into the doors of number 10 Downing Street. But all of these questions were clearly posed in terms of class power and the nature of crisis and the whole business of how the absolutely parasitic nature of the ruling class and its willingness to impose huge sanctions on the workers. I think there's a whole series of things that should be drawn out. First of all, I think that the one thing about Greece that we should draw out is the nature of Stalinism itself within Greece, and the fact that Stalin himself handed Greece over to the capitalists. Stalin himself, in agreement with Churchill in Moscow, wrote down in their whole. They did actually have an agreement across the whole of Europe as to which countries were going to be where and who was going to control what. And Stalin himself assigned Greece to the capitalists in counter-revolution. and therefore, sentenced the Greek workers and fighters to death. And this was carried out by the Greek Communist Party, who were as responsible, because obviously as they carried out the orders of their master and allowed the counter-revolution to take place and to enter into the country and even to massacre their own cadre, which of course is not untypical for Stalinists. So in those terms, I mean, we should be really quite clear about that. I think that that also applies to SYRIZA. I mean, SYRIZA itself, of course, the core of it comes from a section of the Greek Communist Party. So the evolution of SYRIZA is not particularly, or shouldn't be, a particular surprise, and not least, of course, also because of the fact that you could immediately see the character of the thing. And the first thing they did, as soon as they got into office, was to align themselves with the right-wing party, the Independent Greeks, ANEL. I mean, really, it's not sort of thing anybody who's actually going to take on a serious fight against the capitalist class, which clearly was what was on order in Greece was going to do. And I think, I mean, if you look at it, it's then quite clear, I mean, the interesting about Varoufakis, of course, is he goes through his whole experience of going around, the capitals of Europe pleading for reason. Whereas, of course, they merely spent their time kicking them in the teeth. They didn't want reason; they want blood. They want blood and the flesh of the workers in Greece, and they want to prove that they will go to any length, basically, to maintain the German banks who'd lent, are actually on the hook for most of the money that went to Greece. It was actually to hold up the German banks. And I mean, surely, I mean, the whole questions, clearly the whole questions of power are raised in Greece. The question of the expropriation of the banks. The first thing, expropriate the banks. Surely, I mean, the first thing of any socialist, quite clearly in Europe, or indeed the US or wherever else, is to expropriate the banks, because these things only exist because they are propped up by nakedly by the state and by basically subventions, taking money from the working class to hold these things up. They wouldn't exist otherwise. I mean, if you said tomorrow, if as I say, in the extremely unlikely event of John McDonnell ever making chancellor, you would advocate, or indeed any leftist, a proper one, you would advocate, such a move as to say, we will cease all support to the banks, because actually the banks only exist because of state support. If you said tomorrow, the state guarantee to the banks will be ended, and all the banks who wish to continue to survive will come into state to be state ownership and control, no cost, and the rest of you can take chances. And basically, the system would collapse within hours. The banking system would collapse within hours. There's no question of that, and that's the depth to which we're at. So I mean, for me, I think that it's really a central point in terms of looking at what happened in Greece and the lessons it bears for all of us. Because all of these questions exist for all of us. Particularly in Europe, but also in the rest of the world. Thanks, comrades.
Thank you, Matthew. David Hempson.
Yeah, look, I think this is a very lively discussion, and it's marvelous that we've got such an array of people who've actually participated in the struggle and have got somewhat different ideas. It's very important that we have different views and perspectives to be able to work out what's happened. I mean, this morning I was listening to an analysis of Albania, which borders on Greece. And after all the politics were discussed about the recent election, I think it's taking place today, there was just one conclusion. The children in that state want to leave. As soon as they've got some education, all they have in mind is to leave their country and to seek employment somewhere else in the world. And that seems to be what we've achieved, what has been the result of the devastation under neoliberalist control of the Greek nation and the Greek people. And the difficulty when we have such confrontations, as I think the language of the comrades has shown, is that it is very easy to polarize a country between a nation and the rest, and to say we are fighting for the Greek people against the Europeans or against the Germans, and to make some comments about German brutality in the war. All of that, I think, was, let's put it this way, the nuts and bolts of the way in which the campaign was run. And you know, it seemed to be the language adopted rather than the class position. Although I imagine that was also combined, you know, with it. There were national elements definitely at play here. But there are a number of factors. The first factor I'm mentioning is the devastation of the country and the demographic shift, in the sense that also in Greece, it seems that the youth just want to leave. In other words, the basis of a nation has been disrupted entirely, you know, by this neoliberal policy. The second point really is that the capitalists were in some division. And although I haven't explored it completely, and I think Roger's book does, there was a difference between what the IMF was saying and what the EC was saying. The IMF was saying, well, actually, we need to have some more Keynesian policies here to be able to rescue the economy at some level or other. Because even now, you know, there's no effective release from debt in Greece. And the EC, and particularly the German capitalists, were insisting that they get their pound of flesh back. And the general rule is that the capitalists, that if you invest in something and it goes wrong, you take your losses. But the capitalists refuse to accept that. That's the role of the state, to rescue national capitalists when there's an economic investment which has gone disastrously wrong. And that's actually what, you know, they were facing up to. The question really in terms of politics was, how was it possible, how was it possible to maintain a resolute resistance to the neoliberal program and to split the capitalists, or at least to try and split the capitalists, and to be able to save what could be saved, you know, in Greece. And it seemed that the strategy of the capitalists generally was, as Keynes put it, he says, my policy, and he said this somewhere in the 1940s, it means to take out resolute action, which actually may not be possible politically. So even Keynesian policies were not possible at that time, in the sense that the capitalists were not able to recognize the depths of the mess that they were in. And if we look at it now, it's a very different position. In other words, each situation arises with its particular political characteristics. Now, trillions are being spent, maybe without ever being regained again in terms of national, you know, in Britain, in America, and possibly elsewhere in Europe. Money is actually not the question, but it was absolutely the question then. In other words, capitalists have different criteria for expenditure at different times. When they face devastation, as at the moment, they're prepared to roll out the cash, at least to the metropolitan states, and to engage themselves in massive national debt. But if it is to rescue a small country on the periphery of Europe, they will not do it. So that raises some national issues, but it does raise fundamental issues, I think, in terms of class solidarity, and that is timing. I think the point has been made by the Greek comrades on the left, well, let's say not the comrades, but at least those on the left, that actually the working class, the parties of labor in Europe did not rise to the occasion. And this actually is the case that when we look at many of the international struggles at the moment, we can see that immediately solidarity in Belarus and others, the solidarity is absolutely pathetic. And it's the same in any particular struggle. The solidarity with the Namibian workers at the moment seems to me pathetic. In other words, workers are not automatically rising, but over time, as we found with the Liverpool struggle, the strike, workers do come once the issue is made time and time again, and then it does return. The question is how to maintain a strategy which keeps the struggle alive, while at the same time bringing in the forces of solidarity, which only mature over time. And it seems to take a long time because the leadership is not at all keen, you know, to throw its resources into a struggle which is beyond their national boundaries. International solidarity is what we fight for. It's not what the existing bureaucracy is prepared to entertain. And that involves deep political and industrial struggles to be able to resolve. So I agree that, you know, with some of the comrades, that some of the particularities need to be gone into. But I think the point that Roger's been made, that a class position, and then let's say more than that, a position which actually builds on the political solidarity of that 62% or 61.9%, you know, was a treasure, which I think we could have seen a lot more use made of. It wouldn't have resolved immediately in a socialist, you know, resolution, and there would have been struggles for a time, but you wouldn't have seen the devastation that has taken place in Greece as we see right now. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Next speaker is Rob Dyer.
I have a question for people who've spoken. It's a fairly open question, and that is, had Greece, after the referendum, had the SYRIZA government defaulted on the debt, and I accept that it's possible that they never had any intention of defaulting on the debt, but had they defaulted, would Greece have been, would a strong Greek government been able to withstand the response of the troika, or parts of the troika? And one can look at, because I do agree with Dave that you wouldn't have seen an immediate rush to assist the Greek working class from other workers around Europe. I think there's no chance that would have happened at the time, and as you've said, it's not the kind of action that could happen now. So I think one must accept that the Greek people would have been on their own for a fairly extended time. Could they have withstood the response from a complete default, or could they have done a partial default to try and blunt the onslaught of the troika, and maybe to open up divisions, as David suggested, that there may have been between the IMF and the other parts of the troika? Thanks.
I welcome you to come back into the discussion.
Yes, there are a few very interesting things that I would like to comment on. One, first of all, SYRIZA was not just a section of Stalinism. There is a long story of distancing themselves from anything Stalinist. I mean, it doesn't mean that they got rid of all the Stalinist ideas, but it was a very different thing. Second thing, it wasn't only Stalinists there. A lot of small groups, so-called revolutionary groups, joined in, and for the first time, all these that had been sects before, they became a coalition. And some of them were openly Trotskyists. Let's not forget that Greece has a great tradition of Trotskyists. Trotsky's successor in the Fourth International was Michel Raptis, Pablo. And he was active in Greece for a long time after his group became a small group. So the discussion in SYRIZA was a very complex one. It wasn't as if they had an idea and they put it forward and they messed up on the basis of that. There was a lively discussion, continuously changing policies, contradictory policies. Even ministers of SYRIZA, they had contradictory statements every other day. Also, this question of aligning with the right-wing party. Yes, they did align with the right-wing party, but they had to choose. One, try to govern Greece in some way at that time, or call elections again. And the Greek people were getting tired of all these attempts and attempts and attempts. So they said, we are going forward. And I think they were correct. There were all these ridiculous appearances of Kamenos with throwing wreaths on the anniversary of the sea battle of Salamis and this sort of thing. But he was just a joke figure. A more serious mistake, in my opinion, was to appoint as president of Greece someone who was definitely right-winger. That was much more dangerous if things came to a showdown. We know whose side he would be on. As far as playing the national card against the Europeans, against the Germans, and this sort of thing, that wasn't the SYRIZA position. Yes, some SYRIZA cadres did that. Some SYRIZA ministers brought up these issues, but the main drive of SYRIZA was, we have to go together with Europe. We have to find a way with Europe. We have to change European policies. And this was bearing fruit. And I don't think that it was just something that we should think that it was a secondary issue. European parties and European movements were becoming more and more openly in supporting SYRIZA. And that was a very interesting position, in the sense that after the referendum, and I'm going to say a few words about what were the chances of Greece's defaulting. There were a number of European countries that would have elections, and we don't know what would happen if there was if the defiance of Greece continued after that. Now, could Greece withstand the European response? Probably not, but for a time it could. And certainly Varoufakis' proposal seemed to have him planning for at least 6 months of survival, whatever Europe would throw at them. So in 6 months, a lot could happen. But then we should see that the Russian Revolution, which Russia was by far bigger issue, they had to play this, to take these risks. They had to take a revolutionary way and try it out. It didn't work in there. It was isolated. Europe didn't come to their rescue. And we had what? We had Stalinism. That's no consolation for a revolution. It was a failure in a sense. But what a failure. We could do with more such failures. And Greece could have played that role independently of their leaders, independently of what we think about Varoufakis or Tsipras or the rest. They chose not to. And they chose not to for these very serious questions. They realized that they couldn't withstand the European onslaught, but they were not prepared to see the dynamics of the possibilities that were opening up. Also, I must say that this is not something that we see in the aftermath. At the time that the events were unfolding, we were writing articles and bringing out pamphlets dealing with these issues. And I mean, I could send a set of these pamphlets to Roger so that anybody who wants to see them could see them, because they are. It is interesting that we were discussing it, and we were trying to find a way out. And this not only in Cyprus, but also we had comrades in Greece who were trying to do what they could. We couldn't do much. We hope to do better next time.
Okay, thank you, Themos. I'm going to call Finn Barghini.
Comrades, there were three tremendous contributions from Sotiris, Themos, and Roger. I want to compliment them on that. I want to make a point about international solidarity, because that's the key way to understand the resolution of the problem that has been faced by the government in Greece. There were 4 other European countries in a similar position at the same time: Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Ireland, all facing massive attacks, programs of austerity, where the European banks were insisting on being paid in full any money that was due to them. So there were other countries in a similar situation. In Ireland, in particular, there was a big resistance to these measures that the government introduced. There were mass demonstrations. And it's worth noting that the Greek flag was widely present in these big demonstrations. There were demonstrations in Dublin of tens of thousands of people. There were strikes as well as demonstrations. And all the time, the Greek flag would appear on these marches because Greece was an inspiration to a lot of these countries. And there should have been, and the call was raised at the time, the Greek comrades might be able to refer to this, the call was raised for an international conference against austerity in Europe during this period of the attacks on the various countries. As I said, there were 5 countries involved: Portugal, Italy, Spain, Greece, and Ireland. And as I said, Greece was an inspiration. The resistance in the various countries was defeated in different ways. It wasn't a uniform, a universal defeat simply and purely. In the case of Ireland, the Labour and Trade Union leaders refused to maintain the struggle, and the Labour Party went into a coalition. The government collapsed, the government parties collapsed, and the Labour Party went into a coalition with a Conservative Party. And other countries similarly, with the collapse of the left various parties. But there should have been an international meeting of these workers in these countries against the application of austerity in a number of countries at the same time. And Greece alone, for a period, resisted. And that was the time to have the Conference of Solidarity and the expressions of solidarity, but it didn't come. But it was called for. With regard to the European Union, we often mention the European Union as being one of the organizations that stood foursquare against the advances that have been made in Greece. But something we need to reflect on. A decision was made in Europe by the Commission, and all the countries of the European Union are on that Commission, and they voted together to oppose the movement in Greece. So the Chancellor in Britain supported the austerity. The Irish Finance Minister supported the movement against SYRIZA in Greece. And all the various representatives on the European Commission and on the Council of the European Union all represent the individual countries, and they individually went to form a majority on these bodies. So the European Commission and the Council of the European Union, both of which opposed the SYRIZA government, all of these bodies, or each of these bodies, contain representatives of the various countries of the European Union. And they should have been called to account in their own parliaments for the roles that they were playing in these particular decisions against the movements that were being made by SYRIZA. So like I said at the beginning, the issue is one of international solidarity. The only way the Greek movement could have succeeded was with expressions of support and actions in support of the SYRIZA government. And in particular, the other countries that were affected by similar movements of austerity, such as the ones I mentioned, should at the minimum have met together in solidarity with the Greek comrades. That didn't happen, and that made it easier then for the capitalists to pick off the European Union. The issue about the division, to pick off the Greek resistance, the issue about the differences in the capitalist class or representative of the capitalist class is interesting. The International Monetary Fund certainly began to ease the probably fearful of the implications of a tough line all the time on austerity. And the European Commission and European banks maintained a tough line. But the important point is the European banks, as well as the Commission, as well as the Council of the European Union, have representatives on that from the various countries, from all the countries of the European Union. And countries need to have a look at their own countries as well to see what was the reaction. How many ministers of finance were asked in their parliament, what vote or what decision did you make in the Commission, in the Council of the European Union, and also, by the way, in the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank has representatives of all the central banks of the various affiliated countries in the European Union. What decisions were made by these banks and by the finance institutions of the state at the meetings of the European Central Bank? So these are issues we have to face up to, not just in the historic analysis of what happened in Greece, but in what's happening now and what will continue to happen in the countries of the European Union.
Okay, thank you, Finn. The next speaker in the discussion is Dave Buxton.
Thanks, Roger, for your introduction and your book, which I think you should really be selling your book a lot more than you did, because I read part of it again, having read it before, and it's an excellent brief history of the Greek working class, modern working class, which I think everyone should read. And I think particularly because, for me, with a working class with such a high level of struggle and the things that they've been through, it poses so many lessons for all of us as Marxists and socialists. I want to raise a few points. In your book, Roger, you mentioned about the private debt being converted into public debt. And to me, that seems like a fundamental issue that needs to be expounded upon. You do say in the book that at the point of entry into the EU, Greece's proportion of public sector was 25% of gross domestic product. So how did this transformation take place, where it was that the private debt, and I think you say in the book it was 55% of their debt, became public debt? The next issue I would want to just to throw out there is about the importance of party or organisational democracy, because in the book you talk about how the Central Committee at critical points opposed the parliamentary party and cabinet of SYRIZA, who were trying to push through austerity. And at one point, I think after the referendum and the memorandum that's agreed by the troika, there's a narrow majority in the Central Committee of SYRIZA against the deal that had been made. And yet the parliamentary party completely ignore the party itself. Now, obviously that has lessons for the UK, but it also probably has lessons for all of us in the parties that we belong to. So in the Labour Party, we have a long history of the parliamentary party being at the top of the pyramid and basically dictating to the party. And why should it be that way? Particularly in Britain, where Corbyn built up the party as to be the biggest left-wing party in Europe. And yet we as members, particularly now that Keir Starmer has taken over, have virtually no say in anything. And that can't be right. And the issue of party democracy, if we raise that more, and we could use the example of why party democracy is important, because when it came to a critical point, if people want socialism, and you've always allowed the parliamentary party to dictate to the mass of the party, then it's sort of inevitable that we'll be sold out because there's a lack of democracy. At the same time, I wasn't aware that leaders of SYRIZA were talking to other European lefts. And I'd like to link that to something that I remember a couple of decades ago, the World Economic Forum and the European Economics Forum, etc. If a similar situation arose again, let's say with Portugal or Italy getting into that situation, would that be something that we could sort of try to spark off an internationalist movement through an economic forum type organization? Or because otherwise it's like having a broad party of the left across Europe, which I understand there is, where we could then argue international solidarity, but through some form of international organization. And the last point I want to make is I was interested in Femos talking about SYRIZA having a short program and why he thought that was effective. And I'd like him to sort of expand upon that. I'd be interested to hear, because I think we do have to think very carefully about what are the right sort of tactics to use to win over larger sections of the working class who want to struggle. And it seems to me having a shorter program with powerful demands, so obviously anti-austerity, because with COVID coming into this new phase where there's going to be more vaccinations and the economy opens up more, it's bound to be that the capitalist class are going to say, okay, we're going to make you pay all of the debt that arises from what we've had to do through the measures for the pandemic. And we ought to say no. We shouldn't be made to pay. We've already paid one huge debt from the financial crisis that had nothing to do with us. We didn't cause it. The bankers and all of those capitalist financiers caused that crisis, and we're not going to pay for this next crisis. So if we had a short program, I think which we put to the working class, which attacked all parties that supported austerity, which in the UK, unfortunately, will probably include the Parliamentary Labour Party, then I think it would have a dramatic effect on winning support. But I think the whole issue about the Labour Party in Britain and what happened to SYRIZA, to me, throws up the debate about whether we should say, well, if the party that we belong to or support is a pro-austerity party, should we be in that party or should we be out of the party? And we should pose that question a lot clearer, because I can't see that. I know we'll be critical of the party that we're in, but I think we should push that more to the fore, that perhaps we could build a movement, not like SYRIZA in terms of the way it sold out, but in terms of what it was aiming to do, drawing on the lessons of why it led to defeat, talking about the need for democracy within these left-wing organizations, and then bring into sharp focus how if we are going to achieve a better society, a socialist society, then we need new forms of organizations that are 100% committed to anti-austerity, but also to changing society through new forms of organization and for working class struggle. So I just wanted to throw those issues into the mix.
Right, thank you very much, Dave. Some very interesting and important questions there. I'm going to call in Meropi.
Yes, so very, very interesting introductory and interventions. I would like to go a little back, and comrades have spoken about the unequivocal importance of solidarity among countries, the left movements among countries. But I want to go to another issue, to bring it to the discussion, because it is not a new issue. It's about the splitting of the left, the necessity, the importance of finding ways against this splitting. This is related also with the question or the comment about the coalition of SYRIZA with ANEL. If KUKUE, the Communist Party of Greece, would have voted would have given a vote of trust to SYRIZA, they would not have the need of ANEL to make the government. And this is not only for that, it is a more general thing, that the issue, problem that we have to face, how to fight to bring all the left movements in a country together. And if Greece does not manage, in Greece they do not manage, I cannot speak about other countries, I know about Greece, and I know even more about Cyprus, where we have a big party and then small movements, and there is an effort to bring the things together instead of having only comments and complaints towards the main party and from the main party to the others. But in Greece, this splitting, this difference, this distance has also impact on the working class as such. Having strikes from the one syndicate, which is affiliated to the Communist Party, and having strikes from the syndicates which are affiliated to SYRIZA. This was the thing that I wanted to bring in, and thank you.
Okay, thank you, Merope.
Yes, comrade, I cannot raise my hand. So
okay, Sotiris. Yeah, come in.
Just I would like to comment on some very, very interesting ideas that were put forward. First of all, things cannot be resolved in Greece alone. An international effort, an international appeal and effort to unite the movement is absolutely necessary. I think this is the most important inheritance of SYRIZA before its capitulation. Greece, said a number of comrades, started much earlier than the rest of the European movement. Still, I believe that there was a potential if they had really stressed on uniting the movement during their negotiations. But it seems that they didn't really believe in the strength of the people to change things. They didn't really believe that it's not the negotiations that were necessary to gain the support of the people, but the mass movement of the people that had the chance to change things. Finbar, if I call its name correctly, spoke to the necessity at that time of an international conference. I believe that this was one of the things that SYRIZA government could have done, together with many other things, to call for an international conference, not in general, but of the left parties of Europe at that time, calling for the German left-wing party, for Sinn Féin, for Podemos to be there, calling them in front of the whole people of Europe. That could have the potential of changing things dramatically. SYRIZA government, SYRIZA, before it was elected, as I said in my speech, really sent representatives, even Tsipras, to conferences of left parties of Spain, of Ireland. I still remember Tsipras with the leader of Podemos holding their hands at the end of the conference of Podemos in Spain, stressing that together we'll change Europe. There were a number of things they could have done during the negotiations. They were gaining the support of people during the negotiations, but they were not building the necessary structure. During the negotiations, SYRIZA should have been sending its representatives in every corner of left party and labor union of Europe to really build concrete support, organized support for what SYRIZA was doing. In any case, they didn't do that. So answering now to the comment of Comrade David, if the government of SYRIZA really rejected the proposals of of the European institutions, what chances did they have? I don't think they had chances. If they rejected without having prepared the movement, organizing the movement in advance. This is what they didn't do. But this is what we must do in the next effort of any, to really spread the idea of organizing, not just appealing, organizing the movement on a pan-European level is absolutely necessary. Yeah, I think that that are the important things that must be raised from this discussion. How we move forward in the next European movement against austerity and against the institutions.
Thank you, Sotiris. At the moment, nobody has their hand up electronically, and nobody is waving to me on the screen.
Can I just one more thing to add?
Please go ahead. Yes, Sotiris. Yes, yes.
I found what Dave said, what Finbar said at the end, that Dave or Finbar, I don't remember. It's where do we work? We work where the working class gives battles. It's the number one criterion, I believe. It's not what the leadership really does or says at the moment, but where there is a mass, there are masses within this party, whether this party represents masses that at one point at least elected this leadership, these parties to give struggle against capitalism. This is the most important criterion.
Okay, very good point, Sotiris. Yes. Joe Duffy, please come in.
Totally negative. I just mean it in terms of a very sober appraisal of where things are at. I think what the Greek experience showed is that really there are almost no chances. We can talk about raising it and calling for international forums and conferences and putting resolutions, but there is zero chance of creating any solidarity across Europe and any European country to any official or any really influential extent in the event of any country, be it Portugal, Italy in the future, or Greece again, precisely because the weakness of the labour movement, the labour movement has just taken such a backward step in terms of just every individual union looking after its own members. If they're involved in a federation, the federation by and large just pays lip service towards like international solidarity. We'll have a committee in relation to international solidarity. They'll pass a few resolutions, but really nothing will be done beyond some demonstrations that are organised by often smaller left-wing groups in those countries and so on. Even though, as Finn says, at some very large demonstrations in Dublin, the Greek flag was raised and was carried. Nothing really big came of it, and I didn't expect anything to come of it because I knew at official level they weren't prepared to do anything. So what it shows is that really any country that does involve itself in taking on international capital, taking on the power of international finance, EU, whatever, stands almost zero chance of effectively getting the kind of solidarity that we used to speak about in terms of Europe in the last century, in the earlier part of the last century. That just is not on the cards. So therefore, for the Greek comrades, well, the question, or the Cypriot Greek comrades, what I would ask is there, this is maybe not very politically correct, but in terms of an alternative, given that default was not, did not happen, the Greek drachma was not chosen, the Greeks did not leave the EU to go and just try and build their own economy based on the EU drachma. Is there any chance that the Chinese would be interested in a partnership with Greece? Maybe the Russians, that if there was talk of kind of a bloc, a new economic bloc, whereby they were prepared to see a trading relationship with the Greeks, or sorry, with the Chinese and the Russians. Obviously, I'm not talking about something as outlandish as the Greeks joining up with the Russian or Chinese currency or anything like that. But I'm just talking in terms of trading relationships. Could they strike out on their own in terms of providing tourism, providing transport, providing a way into Europe or a way into different parts of the world, given the way the Chinese are looking to expand? Would they be better off in moving that direction if there was an attempt made again to enforce massive programs of austerity in the future, given that I would say that there's been very little progress made in relation to the debt? So that's just a question for the Greek comments. It's very left. It's not even left field. It's way out there. But at the moment, in the absence of a really strong left, and particularly the absence of solidarity in Europe, no matter how much we will try and build for it and call for it, we do not have that influence, you know.
Okay, Dominic's got his hand up in Trinity's iPad. Dominic, you're still muted.
Yeah,
now you're with us. Now you're with us. Yep.
Can you hear me all right? Yeah.
We can.
Just Joe. Yeah, just Joe's comment sort of spared me, because I think as far as Greece is concerned, I'm a bit ignorant about the whole ramifications. But I think the point that the comrades have made spins to me around the question of what lessons do we learn? Not that we turn around and say, well, they failed, so everybody's going to fail. It's a question of what lessons can you learn from it? And this whole question that if you go into the next battle on the basis that Syria did, thinking that they can negotiate on a national level with the capitalists of Europe, or the capitalists of Russia, or the capitalists of China or America or anybody else, and think that they're going to get a decent deal out of it and that they can do it by themselves, I think they're missing the whole point. The whole thing is, it's a question that you start the fight for working class solidarity on an international basis from day one. You don't do it when you're at the end of the road, you do it when you're at the start of the road. That's the only way, in my view, you're going to start changing the outcomes. You know, it's like going into a negotiation with the employer and sitting there and at the end of it saying, well, we've got nowhere, so we'll have to do something. You start the fight before you go in to see the employer, you start the campaign before you go in to see the employer, and then you face the employer with strength, and you've already secured partial base outside, hopefully. If you don't, you're going to have to, work the best you can with the situation you've got. But you don't just say we can't do it and therefore we should never bother. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dominic. Any other comrade want to come in?
Can I answer that point there, Ed? Sorry.
Okay, Joe, go for it. Yeah. No. Just in fairness, so I'm not misunderstood. Maybe the comrade misunderstood me. I'm not, for 1 second, advocating that we don't try, or we don't start, or we don't do what is required, and you try and build that. And I would be involved on a day-to-day basis in trying to do that, and have been for years and years, in passing resolutions of solidarity, whether it's for other strikes or other, whatever it was over the years. What I'm trying to say is that at official level, there is just no appetite for the officials in the trade unions that I see at general secretary level and so on to really drive this. Executives don't drive it. It's rank and file people like yourself and myself and the comrades here who put forward those resolutions looking for that kind of thing. But it's just not really feasible to expect that it's going to happen. That's not to say we shouldn't do it, and we keep doing it, and we should put forward that is what should be done. But it's not realistically going to happen for years until there's a mass movement of left-wing, a mass united campaign of left-wing parties moving on stuff like that in Europe in years to come. And maybe that will happen. But what I'm asking about is right now, and maybe back in the day when the Greeks opted to capitulate, was it not maybe a better option for the Greeks
to have left the euro and try and link up with, yes, the bureaucrats of China and the bureaucracy of Russia, who don't give really two hoots about Greece too much, but they may have had an economic interest in cooperating and building new trading relationships. They wouldn't have wanted to import trouble or anything like that, because given the example of the Greek workers, I'm sure that would have appalled the Chinese bureaucracy and appalled the Russian bureaucracy. But nevertheless, when things died down, there may have been a possibility of building some sort of links, because the Greek economy, they could not on their own have struck out maybe and survived for too long. I don't think there was the confidence to do that. Having said that, they may have actually ended up in a better position than they're in right now, given the devastation that's taken place, having capitulated and having had a massive new austerity inflicted upon them. So it's just a question of right now and the next couple of years, in the absence of that solidarity that I'm talking about and the prospects for it, we need to be realistic about that. Could it not have been a better option back then for them to look outside of the EU bloc and look to build with other countries in the Europe and outside of Europe, whether they've been South America, China, or Russia, or wherever? Okay, that's the question.
Just very briefly from the chair, I'd just like to make the point that China's investing massively in a lot of different parts of the world now, particularly Africa. And almost everywhere where it's investing, one of the conditions upon which it invests is suppression of the independent labour movement, suppression of the workers' movement. If Dominic wants to say something brief, please come in.
The basic point, I mustn't have come over properly, but the international support we're looking for is not for capitalists to come in and fight other capitalists on our behalf, because that's a pipe dream. The international support we're looking for is working class international support. And if that means going round the leadership of the trade unions and the labour movement, political labour movement, which you'd have to do, Corbyn's not Corbyn, but in Britain, you know, it's not going to be Keir Starmer who's going to be looking to it. You look to the rank and file of the party and what you can build up there. And I thought that's what we were all about. And anyway, I'll leave it there.
Okay, there's scope in that theme for perhaps another discussion sometime later, and it's good that Joe's raised this point and Dominic's sort of trying to develop it. Comrades, I'm going to now ask, Themos, you've got your hand up. Themos, would you like to make a few closing remarks, and then we'll go to Soteris, and then we'll go to Roger?
Yes, fine. First of all, it's interesting to see what happened with the Chinese actually. Varoufakis approached them and they discussed that they could buy some of the privatized industries themselves, and especially the rails and this sort of thing. And they agreed on a lot of things. And what he was, and when he asked for some money that he needed it, they agreed that they would give him $1 billion or so. And then they didn't give him $1 billion, they gave him something like 100 million, which was just not enough to make him able to face Europe. And when he tried to find out why, because the Chinese were warned by the European Union not to give this money to Varoufakis. So I don't think China was a possibility at that time, and Varoufakis is quite convincing on that. And I don't think it's a possibility today. And this, I think, should make us very skeptical about any attempt of Greece to go alone outside the European Union, hoping for that they would find friends in the Chinese bureaucracy or the Russian capitalists. The drachma was not a possibility. The only possibility was European solidarity. And I don't think at that time it was an impossible task. Things were stirring. things were happening. People were moving. And imagine what would happen if Tsipras wouldn't capitulate. I mean, it would take the whole battle on a totally new level. And people might move more resolutely and give the Europeans a good run. I'm not over optimistic of their chances, but they had a chance. The other thing I would like to say a few things is the program. That's a real interesting thing that I think we should organize a whole discussion on what this is. Actually, SYRIZA put forward what they call the Thessaloniki program, which was a beautiful transitional program in the sense that it had some demands that were pointing towards the direction they wanted to steer Greek economy. And the people responded to it. Varoufakis himself was furious when he saw the program because he considered it too radical. But this is another story. So the point is that the Thessaloniki program was actually less radical than Andreas Papandreou's program in the previous century. The situation is such, both in Greece and in the whole world, that even small reforms cannot be given by the capitalists. So fighting for smaller reforms in earnest, it's bound to lead to revolutionary clashes. And this is something that I called again and again the modest radicalism. We are past the days that reform and revolution were something different. Practically, if we really try to find reforms, we are ending up in revolution. And we have to understand this so that we don't expect that reforms will just happen. We have to fight for it in a revolutionary way. Thank you.
Thank you, Themos. I think you put that very beautifully. Soteris.
Okay. Comrade Joy said that he didn't believe there was a chance for the SYRIZA government to really mobilize the European movement and do something. I believe that the experience of that period shows the opposite. I will just refer to what I said in my introductory speech, that during the time, these 2 weeks that the Greek banks were closed by the institutions of Europe, there were only in Germany 1,000 small and big demonstrations in support of SYRIZA government. That was a report given to us in the town I live by Balavani. That was the woman below Varoufakis, the assistant minister of finance during the period of Varoufakis, a woman that showed courage and honesty and resigned after the capitulation of the leadership. She gave that report to us, suggesting that there was a chance to really change things. And that chance really existed even without the SYRIZA government trying to build up the movement in all the ways that we discussed about, conference of the left, visiting representatives of SYRIZA, visiting every corner of Europe to unite the left and the labor movement. Even without that, there was a chance, she believed, because of all this response of the European movement. It is not to the officials of the unions or of the parties of the left we appeal to. It's to the working class we appeal to. And if we have left, if SYRIZA abandoned Europe at that time, they would have missed the chance to unite the European movement. They would be alone. And whether they had a chance to, in really approaching China or appealing to China. I think Themos and other comrades said it correctly. In the absence of a mood in the working class, now, what do we do, Joe says? If the absence of a mood, if the absence of real struggles and the movement within the working class, there is really no much we can do, but just be patient. During this period, the works of revolutionaries is just patient, day-to-day work until the movement catches up again. There are no shortcuts. If there is no mood in the movement, we just wait, being sure that one day this mood will be present. Thank you.
Thank you, Soteris. Okay, Roger, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you, comrades. It's been a really good discussion, and a lot of the points, really, I don't have anything to add to what Themos and Soteris have said, and I'm really grateful to them for their help on this. I want to make just one or two very quick points. First of all, I'm really sorry that Matthew has left the discussion, because he raised some quite provocative and controversial questions at the beginning of the discussion, and I would have liked to have the chance for him to hear my reply to them. But I mean, the nub of what he was saying is that SYRIZA was out to betray the movement right from the very beginning, because it came from a Stalinist background, and Stalin had signed over Greece to the capitalist world in that famous encounter with Churchill in 1944. Well, I wish it was as simple as that. First of all, I mean, of course, it's all true. All the facts he said were true. But you know, if it was as simple as that, because Stalin had signed off Greece to the West in that famous deal, I imagine everybody's familiar with the story. It is literally true. Churchill tells the story how Stalin actually wrote out. He divided up Europe and divided up the spheres of influence in Russia and the West, and he just said you could have Greece, and that was true. But in that case, it was as simple as that. How does he explain the civil war that followed the Second World War? Because the fact is that the Greek Communist Party just did not have, they were not given the right to capitulate. They were chased back into the country, and they were hounded, and they had to fight back for their for their sheer survival. And the idea that SYRIZA was just an offshoot of the Communist Party, again, it's true in one sense, but in a it's completely misleading to look at it that way. The point is, the Communist Party in Greece was enormously powerful. How is it that it became destroyed and replaced by PASOK? Because of the constant successive defeats that were suffered by the Greek working class under the false leadership of the Communist Party. First of all, they were destroyed in the Civil War. And then they also, because of their, I haven't got time to explain the whole thing, but the second defeat they had with the coup in 1967 was also a defeat which was caused by the false policies of the Communist Party at the time. But with the collapse of the colonel's dictatorship in 1974, the Communist Party was in complete turmoil. It was destroyed. It was replaced as a mass party by PASOK. PASOK had come from nowhere. And it's also wrong to think of PASOK as a traditional social democratic party. When it came into existence, it put forward a very left line. Papandreou, in so many words, said, we're not a social democratic party, we're a socialist party, and that's completely different, and so on. And in fact, the Communist Party split, and SYRIZA came from the critical dissident element within the old Communist Party, the so-called Communist Party of the Interior. And also SYRIZA was a coalition with other forces too. And as Themos said, there had been from the very beginning, there had been quite a strong Trotskyist tradition in Greece too. And that also was represented within SYRIZA. Now, the main point is this. We all, we've said very clearly, yes, SYRIZA betrayed the movement. SYRIZA capitulated to the capitalists and so on. But if it was simply a question of betrayal, then wouldn't life be simple? Because then all you need is to have people with good intentions, and then there you are. The path to revolution is clear. The problem is that good intentions are not enough. And I don't believe that SYRIZA started out in 2015 with the intention of selling out the movement. The point is that they were faced with a real dilemma and real problems and real issues that we've discussed, and all the other comrades have been clear about that. The fact is that in the end, there was no solution within the boundaries of Greece itself. Internationalism is not just a sentimental add-on to our program. It's intrinsic to the whole program of socialism. It's not possible to solve the problems. Certainly it was not possible to solve the problems within Greece or in Britain or come to that within America. It wouldn't be possible except on the basis of international solidarity. And as, no, I won't go into that now. The question is that Greece paid the price of being a little bit ahead of the rest of us. And the question is of the international solidarity. I don't share the pessimism of Joe that the international solidarity is not really a realistic factor in the equation. It's the only solution to the problems of any of us. It's what is the mainspring of our existence. It's the reason why we have these discussions. It's the reason why we want to build a workers' international network, which will be, we hope, a stepping stone towards a real movement of international solidarity and a real single international party at a certain stage. And I think the point is that Greece paid the price of being a little ahead of the rest of us. So I think that now, if the events in Greece came in the context of the worldwide struggle, which we see taking place, even who just still at the early stages of that, then I think the whole situation would have been very different. Why was a deal impossible? Because the international capitalists didn't share the skepticism, that skepticism about the risk of contagion. They were absolutely terrified of contagion of the movements in Greece to the rest of Europe and to the rest of the world. That's the reason why they took such an absolutely draconic stand in resisting the demands of even the most modest appeals for some kind of compromise and some kind of way out. So they wanted to make an example of Greece and to show that as in order to frighten the working class of the rest of Europe. And I think in the situation today, where we see, the prospect of an economic collapse, incomparable perhaps even with the 1930s that is taking place, with the manifest failure of any kind of reformist delusions that we now see. I mean, the policy of Starmer today is one reflection of that there is no prospect. There's not even, he has no chance of even carrying through the kind of limited and superficial reforms that Blair was able to carry out in the new Labour period. Because since the economic crash and since the pandemic and the new economic crisis that is coming, the only hope for humanity is international solidarity. And there's no guarantee of victory. Of course, there's no guarantee, but we come to this at the end of every WIN meeting we've had, where comrades have raised questions like, is there any guarantee of victory? How do we know that there is no guarantee of anything. But in the end, we base our confidence on the fact that in the end, if all other alternatives fail and they're proven to fail, then people will come to the right conclusions. And the only hope for any of us is that we're right on that. And I think the lessons of Greece are very, absolutely crucial to our understanding of how to solve the problems in any country now. I'll leave it at that. Thank you, comrades.
Can I share my favorite image of that period?
Come on, Themos, please do, yeah.
It's the stars and one star.
One red star in the European Union flag.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Themos.
Okay.